Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to today's session Reassessing Incident Response Strategies in Light of CrowdStrike Challenges. I am Reenal Vikiria, and I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, we would like to go over a few house rules. For our attendees, the session will be in listen only mode and will last for an hour, out of which the last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. Now about our speaker, Greg Schaffer. With over 34 years of experience in information technology and security, Greg is a seasoned information security executive, proficient in the information security program and project management, information security risk assessment and mitigation, vendor risk management, policy, standards creation, implementation, disaster recovery, and business continuity. He is the founding principal of vCISO Services, LLC, an information security consulting firm providing small and mid-sized businesses with strategic information security expertise. He hosts the Virtual CISO Movement podcast and is the author of the best-selling book Information Security for Small and Mid-Sized Businesses. He is also a contributor to Now Media's Be Productive television show and has spoken at numerous conferences over 20 plus years. Without any further delay, I would now hand over the session to you, Greg.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to talk a little bit about incident response in light of CrowdStrike. Now, from that introduction, my perspective, I think, is important to understand from my history. So I come from more the networking than the executive side and the risk management side. And it's always important, I think, to understand the perspective of folks that are giving their opinions. And I do have some thoughts about what we can learn from the CrowdStrike incident. And so what we'll cover today is, first of all, what happened, and not really going to go into technical details there, but more from an overall holistic perspective about what happened and how it affected businesses. And then we'll dive in a little bit deeper. We'll talk about some considerations with regards to infrastructure. Obviously, there are some things that we could probably do better, or at least consider. This is all about assessing risk, understanding the risk of what happened, and then mitigating the risk in line with the risk tolerance of the organization. Business continuity considerations, of course, it's very important to understand when these things happened, how you can mitigate to as much as possible the risk of your business not being in operation, because businesses exist to make money, basically. And the more that you're not able to do that, the better chance that your business may not survive. And then finally, governance considerations, and I think this is really important. I'm going to present a couple of angles that I don't think many people have really thought about with regards to the CrowdStrike incident or governance in general. And I think that it's a little bit of a different approach that hopefully will give you some more considerations to think about. And then finally, we'll talk about lessons learned, which of course, with any incident, what do you want to do in the end? You want to understand the lessons that could have come from this. So let's dig into what happened with CrowdStrike. There's a lot of words here, and I'm not going to read it. There's a lot of technical information. This came from the incident root cause analysis from CrowdStrike. You can find that. The URL is on the bottom there, or you can do a search on it. But basically, something bad happened, and it was a single point of failure. It was not anything malicious. It was a misconfiguration, and once CrowdStrike figured it out, they mitigated that. But something bad did happen, and this bad thing affected business operations. This is going to go into a couple of examples in a few minutes. This is pretty evident, though, based on what happened. And as I mentioned before, if business operations are impacted, then revenue may be impacted, and of course, there could be long-term lasting repercussions. So you'll notice that a lot of these aren't necessarily particular to CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike, the issue is what happened in the beginning to trigger this. But from a business perspective, really, they're more interested from how do we survive this event, and how do we ensure that we can lower the risk of it happening again. Now, specifically though about CrowdStrike, while they may have deployed additional steps to further enhance resilience, that's the last line here, likely not every company is doing the same. The tendency is to take the risk that the likelihood is so low that the risk is so low, or is the likelihood really as low as some may assess. That's one of the early takeaways from this. We tend to be a little bit more subjective when it comes to analyzing risk. We think, well, this sort of thing really can't happen to us. And we need to analyze how we're assessing risks right from the beginning. So I would say that one early takeaway for this would be to perform a self-examination to determine how strong all of our bias is, because we all have it when we're assessing risk. I thought this was rather interesting. This is a picture actually of a class schedule board at my gym. Those of you that dealt with the CrowdStrike incident knows that this screen was rather familiar to those who were CrowdStrike customers. But what's also interesting here is because of how pervasive it was, now we have some open source intel that, at least with regards to my gym, it informs me, well, okay, my gym is using CrowdStrike now for its part of its protective infrastructure. Now, I'm not going to do anything with that knowledge, obviously, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that when we have these sorts of events, depending upon who is affected, and with regards to CrowdStrike, it was pretty evident who was affected. They were the ones who were not able to provide services. You can learn a little bit more about their infrastructure, and sometimes that's something that the bad threat actors can use. Well, let's look a little bit deeper now at another company that was impacted by CrowdStrike. And Delta Airlines was one that had a really, really hard issue recovering. So a little bit of the timeline here. On July 24th, the Microsoft CEO emailed the Delta CEO stating that, quote, Delta likely refused Microsoft's help because the IT system was having trouble restoring. Its crew tracking and scheduling system was being serviced by other technology providers. So we're starting to see a little bit of, well, it's not necessarily our fault. You have to look at your infrastructure. And they dive a little bit deeper. CrowdStrike then sent a letter to Delta saying essentially that Delta would have to explain the resiliency capabilities of Delta's IT infrastructure. And then finally, the Microsoft's additional communication on the 13th, they blamed Delta Airlines for the week-long bout of cancellations, saying that the technology was so aged that that caused a lot of the problems. Now, this has resulted in lawsuits, this finger pointing. Now, what does this tell us here? These responses indicate that infrastructure considerations are in fact necessary in incident response, regardless of whether or not the infrastructure was substandard or misconfigured. That's one of the areas that we're going to examine. Now, I mentioned before in the introduction talking about my bio that I grew up, if you will, in IT in the networking side, and that was always the scapegoat. It's always the network. And so I guess I'm a little bit predisposed to being sensitive about that. Instead of looking at finger pointing and looking at scapegoats, let's try to dig down and really try to figure out what the problem was. So let's talk about infrastructure. Some of the items that we're going to look at are technical debt and redundancy, testing updates, keys, and tool exposure. And we want to see what kind of conclusions we can draw from the CrowdStrike incident that will help with incident response, particularly by first limiting the extent of the incident. Because if you can do that, if you can't eliminate the incident from originally happening, you want to try to eliminate or reduce rather the extent of the damage. We have a tendency to incur technical debt. And what is that? Well, that's basically, if you were to like define it at a very simplistic level, it's putting off things that you need to do. Deferring the maintenance is how we talked about it when I was an aircraft mechanic, for example. You can't really defer maintenance past a certain point. But whether or not to upgrade a system this year or next year, when that could mean tens if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, that's a significant business consideration. And there's nothing wrong with incurring technical debt. It just needs to be factored into the risk management, the risk assessment of the corporation. So the insinuation was that Delta, in fact, did have issues due to technical debt. That's what we just saw in those previous quotes. And if that was caused by backing off the funding, well, then how was that decision, how did that come about? Did they do a proper risk assessment? Did the CISO provide some measure of quantified risk analysis, such as, leveraging FAIR? The factor, FAIR is the factor analysis of information risk, I think it is. Acronyms, sometimes they get a little bit tripped up. Point being, though, is that the C-suite needs to make risk-informed decisions. That's what the CISO does. That's what I do. And saying that we must upgrade just because, well, it's best practice to upgrade, well, that's not going to be enough. That's not going to move the needle much with regards to the folks that make the decisions. It's a quantitative decision that you're bringing qualitative arguments to, and therefore you start at a disadvantage, and so does the business. Now, as far as redundancy goes, it's common to have redundancy in a lot of the IT infrastructure. We see this a lot with internet service providers. We see it with backups, redundant data centers. But why not applications? So I submit for your consideration that in this case, with the endpoint software, CrowdStrike EDR, that what if perhaps the companies, instead of relying upon one, that they had two? Some part of the infrastructure uses one, some part uses another. That's maybe a little bit more pie in the sky, excuse me, because this would incur obviously more overhead, not only cost-wise, but management-wise. But it would cut the exposure to something like this happening in half. You would have half of the company still running. Same could be said for using different operating systems. If this was something that just affected Microsoft, well, then perhaps those that were running Mac, Apple, Linux wouldn't have been affected. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is definitely the right thing to do. What I'm trying to do is to get you to think about things that you may not have thought about before as far as how to mitigate the risk of having an incident happen. Now, there's been a lot of talk about testing updates. Well, why didn't organizations test up the CrowdStrike updates before deploying them across the board? This is a little bit sticky to talk about, because by virtue of what an EDR system does, you want those updates put in place as soon as possible. They've seen a threat, they've developed code for it. You're assuming, based on your vendor management program, that's how you're dealing with the risk, that the vendor, in this case CrowdStrike, has vetted the update. Now, sometimes you don't want to do that. You want to have that extra layer of consideration, of protection, if you will, that you just want to roll it out gradually. But in some cases, that may not be the right risk management decision. And again, the reason why I brought this up is that there was a lot of talk of, well, why can't we just scale how we deploy this? Think about if there's a 0 day that this update could have mitigated. How would you then defend the risk decision of not updating all of your systems all at once? It's a very, very difficult decision. Now, again, also with your infrastructure, in some cases, the encryption keys were stored on systems that were affected. Now, the low likelihood of that happening, excuse me, can lull us into a sense of complacency. You never want to have all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. This made it very difficult. In some cases, instead of being able to recover the keys and then decrypt the machine in order to fix the machine, which was very simply just deleting one file, but if you can't get in, you can't delete the file. they had to reimage the entire machine, which of course then is more labor intensive. So maybe having, talk about redundancy too, maybe having the keys stored in a couple of different places might be something to consider. Again, there's a little bit more risk because you're storing your cryptographic stuff somewhere else, but everything in information security is about risk management and making informed risk decisions. Now, as I mentioned before with the gym example, it became example that some organizations obviously were using CrowdStrike for their EDR. If you were one of those organizations, would you change your EDR to enhance security by obscurity? Or is this a low risk, or is there a risk bias involved here? Now, again, I don't have an answer here. I'm just trying to get you to think about items you may not have considered in your response to this incident, even if it did not affect your organization directly. All right, let's jump into a few things with regards to business continuity. So we've got third-party information security, risk management, remote management, and tabletop exercises. Well, third-party information security risk management, or TPISRM, because we love acronyms, because many that were not directly affected still encountered issues, especially if one or more of their third-party service provider was directly affected, then this becomes then a TPISRM, third-party information security risk management problem. And this is one area that businesses seem to do poorly, at least from just my observation. I'm citing 0 studies here. This is just me talking, being in the business for 35 plus years, that this is one area that organizations of various sizes, from very small to very large, seem to do poorly. It's been reduced to basically a compliance exercise. And those of you that have worked here in this field have done some of this, you know the dance. Send me your SOC 2. We'll make sure that you've passed it. There are no relevant exceptions found, or if there were some, that they were adequately addressed, and therefore the report is unqualified. That's the minimum amount of flair, if you will, of what you need to do with regards to a vendor management risk program, third-party information security risk management. And there's a few things here. First of all, excuse me, I'm always skeptical about a SOC 2 that doesn't have exceptions. So if you get one that says there's no exceptions whatsoever, okay, how deep did they actually do the audit? This almost becomes a more check the box episode. And sometimes too, it's like when those of us that are reviewing it, they sometimes seem to miss the system description, which is such a hugely important area in a SOC 2, because that's where you learn more about what they use in their infrastructure, in which case you could have known in advance, if you recorded this correctly, that your third party used CrowdStrike as part of its infrastructure. So there's a lot that the SOC 2 reports can provide. They can provide information about business continuity and the disaster recovery as well. Now, another consideration with regards to business continuity is remote management. We know that since COVID, that there's a lot of us that still work remotely. You know, one of the solutions, the most prevalent solution to this issue, was to delete a file on a machine, which meant that you had to actually sit in front of the machine. And sometimes to talk people through doing this is very difficult, to try to get them to understand how to navigate a file structure and find the file and then actually delete it. So your business continuity program should consider the need to touch every machine, and whether or not it's local or not. And how would your organization have handled that? If it was hybrid or all staff local, well, then maybe they could have brought it into a central location. But if there's some that are fully remote, that's could be a hugely difficult problem. And one could say there's a lot of consideration sometimes about, a lot of talk about return to office and all of that. Well, when a business issues the return to office edict, it isn't just to get people in one place for the sake of doing that. This is one thing that businesses consider, that in order to maintain continuity of operations, it's easier to have everybody that can congeal in one place. Again, I'm not advocating for that, but I'm advocating for everybody to understand the needs of the business when making these risk management decisions. Now, some of this can be practiced with tabletop exercises. Many businesses and staff, though, they see this as just a check the box episode, which is unfortunate because a well-designed and executed tabletop exercise can really expose gaps in business continuity. If you had a scenario that said, all of a sudden, all of your endpoints are no longer able to work. All of your servers are no longer able to work too. What would you do? Well, probably the first reaction would be that that'll never happen. Well, a lot of times with these exercises, we see that things that may never happen actually do happen. And it's good to have done some of the thought beforehand about how you would mitigate that. Because making decisions on the fly in an incident, whether it was with the CrowdStrike thing or any other incident, is going to really cause more stress and cause bad decisions and could lead to a longer recovery and more long-term damage. Now, of course, tabletops can't simulate all situations, but most will cover common elements, continuity of operations and recovery. So let me jump into governance here. Now, when looking at incident response, it's important to understand and define what type of incident it is, recognizing it could be more than one type. Now, this is a survey I did on LinkedIn shortly after the CrowdStrike incident. The survey asked if affected organizations should have classified the CrowdStrike issue as an information security incident. And I worded it that way purposefully, as you'll see in just a moment. 69% said yes. I was a little surprised that 26% said no. Well, some in the comments said that this was better classified as an IT service delivery incident, to which I completely agree. But as I said, I worded the question specifically. This wasn't an either or, rather it was, did you consider this an information security incident? I believe that this little survey brought out an inherent limitation in incident response, that some are conditioned to shoehorn an incident into one category only. And this can obviously affect response. This may have regulatory implications as well. If you want to check out the survey, you can go down to the link there that's in the slide. So here's one of the responses. This was an IT service outage. I won't read the whole thing, but the basic gist of this excellent response was there may have been an IR plan that was implemented, but surely none of the public companies are going to file a report with the Security and Exchange Commission here in the United States. 10K report is one of those. And it's a valid comment that brings up several excellent points. It was an IT outage or incident. But an incident, as I said, that we're starting to learn now, we should look at that it can be classified in many ways. For example, a break in a data center where servers were destroyed with a baseball bat, for example, by a disgruntled employee. Well, that's an IT service outage. It's obvious. But it's also an information security incident from the classical triad definition of anything that impacts confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I think I have them right. Was impacted. Now, if drives were stolen before server destruction and the drives weren't encrypted, then confidentiality was also breached. Finally, it's a physical security incident, obviously, because physical security was breached at the data center. So now, a Microsoft driver incident, as the person reports here, may or may not be classified as an information security incident by the business, depending on the outage effects. We'll go into incident defining in just a moment. The IR plan may have been invoked, but what would not trigger the SEC filing? Now, here's the tricky one. By invoking the IR plan, the incident response plan, is the company essentially admitting that it's an incident? It is, but is it essentially admitting that it's an information security incident that's reportable? I agree with the poster that they likely shouldn't have to trigger an SEC filing, at least my gut reaction does with regards to this. I think the jury is still out on that, but for the sake of argument, we'll just go with that. This is another respondent posted this definition from, well, they posted a definition from the SEC, and I refined it by, you can see the link down there from Harvard. The rules require disclosure of cyber incidents, defining cyber incident to include an unauthorized occurrence or a series of unrelated unauthorized occurrences. So here, first of all, I'm going to avoid the cybersecurity versus information security nomenclature debate. That's for another day. Let's just use them interchangeably here for the purpose of this presentation. The SEC puts forth a qualifier for the type of incident, as noted here. It says unauthorized. The commission leaves related undefined. Well, how would you explain that term to a company trying to figure out whether to aggregate occurrences for purposes of figuring out whether to file an 8K? That's from this document. So another example of this document is that related occurrences could include a series of continuous incidents conducted by the same bad actor. So again, there's some muddlement of definition here. Here's the takeaway. After all of that, if the SEC is making a point to further divide information security incident categories by definitions, perhaps we should as well. So here's another one. This is from FinCEN. And it talks about some, again, I won't read this, but it talks about some gates, if you will, that the incident, the cyber event, they're referring to it as here, but let's just say that means information security incident. In determining whether a cyber event should be reported, a financial institution should consider all available information surrounding the cyber event, including its nature of the information systems targeted. So they're also talking about monetary amounts. Now, FinCEN, for those that are familiar, stands for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. And this is regarding cyber suspicious activity reporting, or cyber SARS. The whole takeaway for here is that there are obvious triggers to reporting. Just because you declare something an incident, an information security incident, doesn't necessarily mean it's reportable. But here's the key. How does your business define an information security incident? My recommendation to everybody is that you refine your incident response plan and make sure that you have clear definitions of levels of information security incident, because there could be very valid reasons where you as a business want to classify something as an information security incident for a variety of reasons. If anything, just your internal response, your risk considerations, but you don't want to trigger the external reporting. You can't make that division definition up on the fly. If you're going to be consistent with the regulators, you have to say an incident that meets these criteria is then something that we need to report. This was the crux of what I was getting to with regards to that question. I purposefully left it a little bit ambiguous. I wanted to know if folks defined it as an information security incident, and then I wanted to see just how far that they subdefined it. I also wanted to see if anybody was going to go the IT route as well. It's a fascinating survey. I think you should take a look at it when you get a chance. So finally, if we get back to CrowdStrike, we could have classified this as an information security incident, not regulatory reportable, an IT service delivery incident, which triggers your business continuity plan, an information security incident that triggers your external stakeholders, or, excuse me, I went too far ahead there, or those were the primary that. All right, so finally, with all incidents, there are a few things that you need to learn from the incidents. The first is the after action report, or post-mortem. I kind of like after action report better. It sounds a little bit nicer, if you will. It's necessary to examine how things went in order to mitigate the damage in case another events happen. If you have an incident and you don't really dive into some of the items, you're not going to learn from it, and then you run the risk of it happening again. Now, as far as being affected, I presented items today that your organization may wish to consider when you review your incident response program in light of the CrowdStrike incident. So whether or not you're affected directly or not directly, you need to include this when you do your risk assessment with regards to the incident. There's just because we don't run a particular piece of software doesn't mean that it couldn't have drastic effects. Again, we've seen that with, say, folks, for example, that relied upon Delta to go fly somewhere. That was an issue. And then I want to talk a little bit about the tabletop exercise. I talked about it a little bit beforehand as far as sometimes people look at it as just a check the box activity. And it's almost impossible to have done an exercise that would have accounted for this sort of incident, but you can have elements that do. I always say that tabletop exercises, they generally cover about, each one covers about 80% of the same things about how you respond with regards to legal, cybersecurity, insurance, marketing, your communications to your stakeholders, how you handle business continuity. Those are all common elements to all incidents, including here with CrowdStrike. And I'll give you an example. Sometimes people, they're not excited about running the tabletops. They take a couple hours, sometimes longer, and takes time away from running the business. People see it, as I said before, as a check the box exercise. But there can be real value. My firm runs a exercise for our clients every year. I have the pleasure of scripting it. I like writing, I'm a writer, and I come up with different scenarios every year. This year happens to be deep fakes, which has provoked a lot of interesting conversations. In 2018, kind of building off the issues and the hype from the bird flu, avian flu of several years before that, I created one that had to deal with a pandemic that shut things down, that made everybody go remote. Every client that I ran the simulation with, this is never going to happen. Never going to happen. Why are we doing this? And of course it happened. Those that did run the exercise were much better prepared. They had thought about things like VPN licenses, enough laptops for the employees, increasing bandwidth for those that had an internal data center. So my point of bringing that up is that even if you're running a tabletop exercise and you start out with the opinion, remember I talked about risk bias, risk assessment bias, of like, well, the chance that this is never going to happen, it's not a risk for us. You should just put that aside and say, well, it's not a risk, but what if? Because then your organization can be more prepared for responding to incidents, no matter what they are, including one as ubiquitous and as damaging as CrowdStrike was. Finally, learn from it. There are so many quotes out there on the internet that you can find with regards to learning from mistakes. This is one of the favorites that I found. The only real mistake is the one from which we learn nothing. You know, I once touched an electrical outlet. I was 3.5 years old, something like that. It was the Christmas tree that was plugged in. I touched the little prongs there and I got a shock and it freaked me out. My mom said, don't worry, that's just juice. She said it was juice, which kind of I didn't understand at first. But the point of that story, though, is that it taught me not to do that, make that same mistake again. Making mistakes is the best learning tool that we have out there, so long as we learn from them. And it's my hope that you, your organization, whether directly or indirectly impacted by CrowdStrike, that you will learn from this incident. Man, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to sit through this and listen, and I'm ready to take any questions right now that you might have.
Thank you very much, Greg, for delivering such an insightful and informative session. We found the webinar very engaging and hope it was valuable for you as well.
It was. I enjoyed it.
So yeah, now before we begin with the Q&A, I would like to inform all the attendees that EC Council's Certified Incident Handler maps to the Incident Handler or Incident Manager role. Anyone with an ECIH certification is eligible for 17,000 plus jobs on LinkedIn globally with an average salary of $73,676. If you're interested to learn more about our programs, kindly take part in the poll that's going to be conducted now. Let us know your preferred mode of training, and we will reach out to you soon. So meanwhile, shall we start with the Q&A, Greg?
Yes, let's if there are any questions, let's open it up.
Sure. Okay, so our first question to you is, looking at the incident, what about the losses incurred by customers? Is CrowdStrike going to bear this burden?
Oh, I doubt. I mean, that could be a question to be settled out in the courts. Of course, there's all the finger pointing that was going on that I mentioned early on in the presentation. But um, to me, the incident is not one that indicates any sort of gross negligence. It was a mistake that was made by CrowdStrike. It's a mistake that could have been made by any company, and I think that it's one of those things where the best outcome from this is going to be perhaps a refinement of processes, not only from those that use CrowdStrike, but also how CrowdStrike maybe deploys. But I would be I don't think that there's going to be any legal standing for customers to be able to get some sort of compensation from CrowdStrike. Now, when you say customers, though, are you talking about if you're talking about the customers that are using the service versus the CrowdStrike customers directly? I guess there would be a difference there. Obviously, the customers that used it directly, if you're talking about CrowdStrike customers, that's something that you'd have to dig through the contract between the CrowdStrike and the actual end user.
Thank you for answering that. Our next question is, how does the issue of materiality affect the type of incident identified? CrowdStrike may have had an impact upon Delta's share price. Material, so should have been formally reported to SEC. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts, and I don't know if they're correct, but they are my thoughts. I would go conservative and report it because, again, let's take away whether or not how they define how Delta defines incident in their documentation. Another part would be, how do you define materiality? It would certainly seem to be that Delta suffered significant losses, as the question noted, because of this. And I don't know if Delta actually has filed or if they're planning to file. But in that particular case, I would think that they should. It'd be interesting to see if they don't, and if the SEC has any action because of that. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you for answering that. Our next question is, can we attribute the failure at CrowdStrike to the failure of the change management process where they failed to do a pilot rollout prior to the Big Bang rollout?
I would think so. They apparently had a change management process in place that they did test it, and it didn't show any sorts of issues. But I think that it shows that their testing process is therefore somewhat flawed, and that would then go back to change management by understanding that as best as possible that the change, understanding all the effects or the likelihood of all the effects and assessing them correctly, but also with change management. And I think this is a great question because a tenet of change management is having a back out, and CrowdStrike should have had some sort of a back out plan for something like this instead of relying upon the end users to have to delete files. And maybe that's something we'll see come out of this. So I would agree that we could attribute the failure to change management, looking at it in a couple of different ways.
Thank you for answering that. Our next question is, where was the ball dropped at CrowdStrike to cause the ripple effect? Was it the change management process to blame?
Well, we talked a little bit just a moment ago about change management, but and again, I'm going to preface this by saying that this and all of this is my opinion. Um, but in the presentation, I talked about complacency. If we get too complacent in how we're doing things, we tend to take a little bit more risks, a little bit more risks, a little bit more risk. We don't even realize we're doing it. From my lifetime history, probably the most famous example of that is when the space shuttle Challenger had an uncontrolled breakup during launch because of a failure of what was really a rather small part in the whole transportation system. But what really led to the failure was constantly accepting more and more and more risks. So, trying to launch when it's a little bit colder, trying to launch a little bit quicker with turnaround, trying to launch before finding a solution to what was already identified as a known problem. So I think that with CrowdStrike, it's like they got complacent in their deployment process. They didn't have a way that they could recall it, and therefore they had this incident. And hopefully from this incident, just like with the Challenger incident, you know, the shuttle rockets were completely redesigned as far as the sections, how they connect, and something good will come of it. Because again, you learn from mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes, and you can't you can't you can't pretend looking at it in the rearview mirror that everybody can get all answers correctly all the time. We're just human.
Thank you for answering that.
Mhm.
Next question is, what is the best way to mitigate such incidents before or after it happened so as to minimize the damage caused?
uh, Part of this is going to come down to doing those exercises, those tabletop exercises. And of course, in order to do those, you need to have in place very robust business continuity plans to include business impact analysis, to include within their reasonable and realistic RTOs and RPOs, so recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives. You need to have all this set up. And the problem sometimes is that doing all that takes an awful lot of effort. And so you might encounter a situation where an organization doesn't want to spend the resources to undergo that certain amount of effort. Well, then the best way to mitigate such incidents then takes a step up. It means educating the board of directors and the C-suite on what the actual information security risks are. I mentioned in the seminar that one job of CISO, or the primary job in my opinion, and as a virtual CISO, is to inform the C-suite and the board of directors of the risk environment so that they can make risk-informed decisions. Now, if they have been informed and they made the risk-informed decision that despite showing the risk of not having a business continuity plan in place, or one that really isn't effective that you just put in place to check a compliance box, if they accept that risk, then there's nothing else that can be done. The business has made the business decision to accept the risk, and you just have to go on from there. So sometimes there's not too much that can be done unless right at the top with regards to culture that they make the risk decisions.
Thank you. Our next question is, are there any metrics you know of regarding this incident with CrowdStrike about time to recover for any affected customers?
Well, I'm not aware of there being published anywhere, and I don't know how you would collect that. I wonder if maybe CrowdStrike would or should or could, maybe if they would be the ones to set up some sort of a program to say how long did it take for you to come back. But then doesn't that set them up for liability as well too? So I don't think they'd step down that path. Maybe if it was crowdsourced and if there was a central location, hey, if you were affected by CrowdStrike, join this particular Signal channel, for example, or LinkedIn channel, or what have you, and report what your recovery time was. And I don't I don't see any of that as well too. So I guess I'm going to have to say that no, there are no metrics that I'm aware of. But if anybody becomes aware of such metrics, please let me know on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is Gregory Schaffer, or you could just, the profile picture you see here is my profile picture on LinkedIn. So.
Thank you. Our next question is, what are ways for those new to get the field to be able to learn about and get involved in incident response?
I always encourage folks that are new to the field to try to learn as much about the business as possible. And whether one of the best jobs to do that in IT and leading up to cyber is at the help desk. And sometimes people say, well, I don't want to do help desk. It's not exciting. Well, it can be. I've done help desk before, and you get to learn so much about the other departments because you're interacting with them. But regardless of that, whether you're in networking like with me, which also gave me the opportunity, obviously, to be involved with all the departments in the organizations I work with, or if you're in other areas of IT, get to learn the business. The more that you learn about the business, the more you learn how the operations go. The more you understand how the operations go, the more you understand their business continuity requirements. The more you understand that, business continuity is part of what I term the resilience triad. So BC and DR, disaster recovery, and incident response, they're all interrelated, but they all rely upon understanding the business. Now, disaster recovery is going to be more about the technical aspects that support the business continuity, that support the recovery objectives. And sometimes that's difficult, but regardless of the position you're in, I think this is ubiquitous probably for a lot of career fields, but don't limit your questions, your knowledge absorption to just whatever you're focused on. You may be a developer, for example, and you're focused on back-end stuff, and that's great. But ask questions like, well, okay, I know where we're developing this database, but what does it mean for the business? Because people will see that. They'll see, okay, you're understanding the what that you do, but now you're going further and understanding the so what. And anytime someone understands the so what, they are much more effective in whatever they do.
Thank you for answering that. Our next question is, how many organizations actually have a IR policy plus and IRP, and how often is it tested? Without throwing CrowdStrike under the bus, as a company, how do you get the accurate facts out to your customers and clients?
I mean, if you're asking how many of our clients have an IR policy and plan, I'd say all, or we're in the process of building them because that's what we do. And we try to ensure that the policies are both realistic and yet not like just off the shelf. And you can't just anybody can. You can find a template on the internet. You can ask ChatGPT to create a policy, which, by the way, I think is an excellent starting point. But you have to then you have to ensure that the policy matches exactly with what the company does, that it matches the risk tolerance of the company, and that it's realistic. But on the other hand, if you don't want to make a policy, I've seen some organizations we've come into that they have policies, including the incident response, that are ridiculously long. I mean, over 100 pages, and that does. I sometimes joke that it must have been a consultant who was paid by the word. That does no good. I mean, you want policies to be able. People don't necessarily have to read them initially, but they need to be able to reference them, and they need to be able to reference them quickly when the need is there. And incident response is not one that you want to look, in the index and try to figure out where it is that you're supposed to go. So I would like to say that they're tested at least annually. That's a requirement of I would guess just about every standard and regulation out there. at least major one. It certainly is a recommendation. If it isn't in any, so if there's something in some framework that isn't in a framework rather that the company is adhered to, but I think it's something that's very important for the risk management, I'll say, well, yeah, it's not in there, but we're not talking about compliance, we're talking about security, so we need to do this anyway. And as far as like throwing, I think you said throwing CrowdStrike under the bus. I again, like I said beforehand, I wouldn't do that with them. They made a mistake, and I believe that they're learning from it. We'll just see how far that goes.
Thank you for answering that. I'll take the last question for the day. What lessons can be learned from the regulatory and business repercussions faced by companies affected by the CrowdStrike incident, and how can these lessons be applied to improve incident response framework?
I think I'm going to go back to what I mentioned beforehand as far as being as well defined as possible with regards to, we'll talk regulatory first. Make sure that your incident response policy, plan, procedure, and all the other ones affected with it, that they do align with whatever regulatory body that your company is beholden to. That's easier said than done sometimes, and sometimes it involves a little bit more work digging in. That's why I went down the path of talking about defining different levels of incidents. I think that's important. At the very least, you have that in place. And the same thing with regards to business repercussions. The more that you can treat business continuity as being something other than something that you got to deal with once a year, even just thinking about it as you're going through your normal everyday processes, because sometimes like ideas come up. That's why I love talking with people across organizations. And one of the first things that I ask them when I'm doing a risk assessment is, do you see anything that's risky to information security that we may want to talk about? Because they're the eyes and ears, and they understand their process. And they may be like, we're doing it this way, but it seems like that there might be a risk if case like this software fails. It'd be like, oh, that's a good idea. So how would I sum that up? Communication across the business, I guess, is the best way to sum it up. And I have to sum it up because I know I'm out of time.
Thank you again to our wonderful speaker, Greg, for answering those many questions and for the great presentation and the knowledge shared with our global audience. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we're looking for more and more sessions with you, Greg. Before we conclude the webinar, Greg, would you like to give a small message to our audience?
I'd like to remind everybody that information security, of which cybersecurity is the technical part of, but it applies to cyber as well. It's all about managing risk when all is said and done. One of the hardest things that I've learned in my career that I had to learn was that risk management mindset. You can't have it one way or the other. You can't have perfect security. You can't have perfect areas. And sometimes wanting to do that is a way of showing that you're doing your job when it's really just the opposite. Those that are really successful in this industry are those that understand risk management principles. And so my suggestion is to learn them and live them, and understand too that what you think is something that's really risky from the cyber perspective, and it may be, from a business perspective, there may be other risk considerations that the executives need to take into account. And just because they say, well, we're going to live with that risk, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're ignoring your assessment. It means that they've made an assessment based on the greater needs and risks of the company that you probably don't know about.
Thank you so much, Greg, for the message to our audience.